In the 1800s, the Dutch colonized what is now known as Indonesia until the invasion of the Japanese in March of 1942 in their plot to overtake the world. The Japanese had no native oil, and they conquered islands to get the oil they needed. Carl was placed in the Bangkok internment camp at age 9. As we interviewed Heather's grandmother, Peggy, we got an insight of Carl's life before, during, and after the war.
Peggy Wegeruff. I've been married to Carl Wegeruff for about 30 years.
How do you know so much about the experiences Carl had?
Carl sometimes talked with me about the experiences of his childhood, and I remember them so well because as an American child, all I heard about was the war in Europe, never about the war in the Pacific. Some of his stories about the war and the prison camps were mesmerizing.
What was Carl's life like before the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies?
Carl's life was one of wealthy parents and a very pampered lifestyle. His mother was half Dutch and half Indonesian, and his father was all Dutch. His father owned 5 bookstores in Surabaya. They lived in a home that was converted from a small hotel. There were many servants around their home. They had a chauffeur who drove them everywhere. They owned a house in the mountains for the summers because living in the tropics brought its own set of problems, like needing relief from the heat in the summer.
How was he and his family put into a concentration camp?
After the Japanese soldiers invaded the island, one day a truck driven by Japanese soldiers came down the road, and each family was ordered to come out of their house, stand in a straight line. The Japanese were looking for Dutch people to intern in prison camps, to be guarded by Indonesians. Dutch people were usually blonde, blue-eyed, and light-skinned. Carl, at 9 years old, was a towhead. His hair was white blonde from the sun. His other family members all had brown hair and brown eyes and passed as Indonesians. So his mother told him to stand very close behind her and be quiet. After the Japanese soldiers inspected all of them and they decided they were Indonesian, the soldiers walked back to the truck to go on to the next house, and Carl stepped out from behind his mother and waved goodbye to the Japanese soldiers. All of Carl's family were immediately herded into the back of the truck and taken to the concentration camps. Each of them was taken to a different camp, except the youngest daughter, who was allowed to stay with her mother in one camp. Not one person in the family knew where the others were for the 3 years all they were in camps.
Can you think of any interesting stories that he may have shared of being in the camp?
Well, camp was a big surprise to Carl. He was one of the youngest males in the camp where he was. The beds were crude boards with straw laid on top of them, and each person had a designated amount of space to sleep. Everyone had head lice, body lice. Many of them had chronic diarrhea. Most of them only had the clothing they came wearing, and all were starved. All the meals were rice with some liquid and completely devoid of all nutrition. Everyone in the camp knew that Carl was a great shot with a slingshot, and when any birds flew over the camp, they got excited and called Carl to bring it down with his slingshot so it could be put into the pot for everyone to get some protein. Each prisoner had a job. Carl's was to hoe the vegetable garden so the Japanese soldiers could eat vegetables. No one of the prisoners ever got any vegetables. Every morning as they arose, they walked out into the sunlight to be counted by the guards. It was the job of the other prisoners to carry out those who had died during the night and dump them somewhere. He told me once about one adult man who left the camp to get quinine for the people in the camp who had malaria. When he returned, the Japanese soldiers stuck a hose down his throat, turned the water on full force, and they would jump on him on his distended belly for fun. That man lived to leave the camp 2 more times to get medicine for the sick and have the hose down his throat until he died. Something that happened to Carl personally, he cut the bottom of his foot up by his toes, and it became infected. So he continued to walk the mile to the vegetable fields on his heel. One day the commandant in charge of the camp called Carl in and told him they were going to amputate that leg. Carl said no, and the commandant said, "Okay, you'll die." That day, an Indonesian who guarded the prisoners while they worked took Carl over to a creek and showed Carl how to take the mud and pack it over the wound to draw the infection out. Carl had to wash off the old mud and put on new mud every morning until finally the infection was gone and his foot healed.
What happened after he was liberated from the camp?
Well, the prisoners received no news of the outside world. They had no idea that the war was over. One day, Carl had a red square of cloth. I have no idea where he got this, but an Indonesian boy outside the camp fence wanted that red cloth from Carl. And the boy outside the camp had a whole cooked chicken and offered it to trade. Carl immediately traded the chicken and started to eat it. But unknown to Carl, the war had ended and the camps had been liberated. Carl's mother was at the entrance of the camp, and Carl saw her, but pretended he didn't see her so he could continue to eat the chicken. They went from the camp to the house of friends who had not been Dutch or interned, and they were welcome to stay until everything was sorted out. Carl's father's bookstores were in ruins. Their home and cars had been confiscated. All their money and worldly possessions were gone. The English soldiers and the Sikhs had fought the Japanese, and the Sikhs were charged with protecting the released prisoners from the Japanese and the militant Indonesians. Carl's father was furious that he could not receive any money or any kind of compensation for the bookstores and the home and the cars and everything. Finally, in a furious state, his father led the family onto a ship, and they left Indonesia for the last time. After traveling around a bit, the family finally went to Holland and were given a place to live and double ration cards after their horrific ordeal in the camps of Indonesia.
How did this experience impact the rest of Carl's life?
Well, when Carl got back to Holland, he had to make up 3 years of schooling in 1 year. His father adamantly warned him, "Do not fight with anyone." While the teenagers he went to school with, who had never left Holland but had suffered from Nazi occupation, taunted Carl with calling him Blauwe on the way to and from school. They resented the Dutch people from Indonesia because they received double rations. Blauwe meant blue one, and that's what they called Indonesians. Heeding his father's voice, "Do not fight," Carl withstood the name-calling as long as he could, until one day he could tolerate it no longer, and he fought. He bloodied the 2 biggest bullies who had been taunting him for months. Bloodied himself by their blows, he looked around after he had knocked them all down at the other boys and urged them to taunt him and fight him until there was no one left who wanted to fight. That ended the taunting, and Carl was able to walk to and from school without fighting. In his adult life, Carl was an exemplary employee. a friendly co-worker, a very polite gentleman, and a truly good person. Psychologically, I believe Carl was deeply affected by his experiences in the camp. He had difficulty with personal relations. The more personal, the more problems. He was not able to be demonstrative to people he loved. He was impatient. He demanded punctuality in himself and others. He suffered no fools. He was unforgiving toward himself.
The Dutch East Indies were liberated at the end of the war in 1945. At 12 and a half years old, Carl had no hair, no clothes except for a pair of shorts, and weighed 80 pounds. Around 170,000 Dutch civilians were interned during the war, and of them 25,000 died.